Shalom. Welcome to this news update about Israel and current events, and most importantly, the United States and Israel relationship. Our first story, and always our first story, is going to be Iran, and looking at Iran's ambitions to acquire a nuclear weapon. We have to be very careful about this because this poses an existential threat to Israel, both in the use of nuclear weapons and also in the region's growing nuclear threat. If Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia is going to want one, Syria is going to want one, and it's going to start just a watershed of acquisition of nuclear weapons. It only takes one nuclear weapon to fall into the hands of terrorists before we have a real problem, besides Ahmadinejad's threat of using it himself. That's our first issue. This week we saw the report from the IAEA, the United Nations watchdog on nuclear weapons, and this was a serious report saying that there is credible evidence, conclusive evidence, that Iran is trying to acquire a nuclear weapon. It's no longer about trying to acquire energy and nuclear energy. Now we're talking about an actual weapon that can and will be used against Israel and American interests in the Gulf. How do we stop Iran? Well, everybody wants to see it attack. And in fact, on this email, you have a link to a report that suggests that Israel might attack before the end of December with American logistical help. That's an important report, and something that we have to be very concerned about. But most importantly, what we'd really like to see are increased United Nations sanctions. The problem with the increased United Nations sanctions, Russia and China are not on board. And until they get on board, we won't have increased United Nations sanctions. In the meantime, until we can get Russia and China on board, we're seeing reports of the EU, the European Union, increasing their sanctions, and Congress wanting to increase their sanctions here in the United States. Although it's not as significant as if the United Nations Security Council would impose further sanctions on Iran, sanctions coming from Europe and sanctions coming from America are significant. That increases the amount of sanctions on Iran, increases the pressure on them to halt their nuclear program. Most importantly, what we have to see is the stop of their program, and any way we can go about doing that, that's great. An amendment was proposed this week by Congressman Deutsch from here in Boca Raton, and it's an amendment that increases the enforcement of sanctions. Sanctions can be passed, but until they're enforced, as we're seeing in Germany, as plenty of German companies are still doing business with Iran, even in the face of threatened sanctions, it's not being enforced. Companies still have a free hand to do business, and sanctions on paper are not sanctions at all. Going on, our next story, the Palestinian move to declare statehood through the United Nations unilaterally without Israel and no direct talks. We want to see the Palestinians come back to the table, have direct negotiations with the Israelis, and establish a state alongside Israel in a peaceful manner, in a healthy manner. The idea of going to the United Nations is not helpful, not healthy, and definitely not the way of establishing a state, and it's just increasing our threats in the region. What we saw was the UNESCO recognizing the United Nations, and now, positive report, UNESCO has cut all spending. As American law is, if any United Nations organization recognizes the Palestinians, not in a manner of through direct negotiations, all funding is cut. They cut off $60 million, and now all spending from UNESCO has to be cut as they no longer have the budget to be able to spend. Hopefully that'll send a clear and strong message to the rest of the world that if they recognize the Palestinians as a state, funding will be cut from the United Nations, and we hope to see the Foreign Affairs Committee from the United States Congress. As we heard this week from the legislative director of our Congresswoman Francisca Wilson threatened this week that United Nations funding could be cut if they go along and increase the Palestinians' recognition in and standing in the United Nations. Hopefully it won't come to that. Hopefully direct negotiations can and will begin. Britain this week announced, along with the French, that if there is a vote in the United Nations Security Council, they will not use a veto. Rather, they will abstain from the vote. Not what we'd like to see. What we'd like to see is a complete halt. This goes along with the news this week of an open mic between Sarkozy, the president of France, and President Obama, where they didn't have the most positive things to say about Prime Minister Netanyahu. That doesn't go along to say that our country and France are not pro-Israel, just says that there is some tension there that really should be worked through. Last story, unfortunate story for us in the pro-Israel community, Dennis Ross, used to be the Assistant Secretary of State and has moved up along in the President Obama administration, a real member of the pro-Israel community, has announced that he's leaving the White House. That's extremely significant and not a story that might garner so much attention, but something that you should pay attention to because one of our friends has now left the White House. We'll hope to see that maybe somebody else from our community can step in. All the best. That's your Israel News. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email rup@brsonline.org. All the best. Shalom.